Thank you for joining us tonight. We are playing opening slides. Live from NYPL presents Anthro-Vision, Gillian Tett with Thomas L Friedman, June 23, 2021, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. This slide shows an image of the featured book. The cover text is set in the center of a red border and reads, Anthro-Vision, A New Way to See in Business and Life, Gillian Tett, author of The Silo Effect. A motif repeats throughout the red border, showing a drawing of a human figure holding a large paper clip with one end bent open to resemble a bow. They are shooting an arrow at an image of a computer mouse pointer. AnthroVision is available for purchase from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shoplive. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live.
Hi, everyone. My name is Faye Rosenfeld, and I am the Vice President of Public Programs at the New York Public Library. I am delighted to welcome you to Live from NYPL with Gillian Tett and Thomas Friedman. They're here with us this evening to discuss Gillian's newest book, Anthro-Vision, A New Way to See in Business and Life. Gillian is a renowned journalist and author and chair of the U.S. editorial board for the Financial Times. Her award-winning work covers a range of economic, financial, political, and social issues. She also has a PhD in anthropology, and her new book explores how looking at the world like an anthropologist can help leaders in a range of fields and industries, and indeed all of us, solve our most pressing problems. Joining Gillian in conversation is Tom Friedman, who of course is the longtime foreign affairs op-ed columnist at the New York Times. Tom's own groundbreaking work has also given us new ways of looking at and thinking about complex global issues, so we really couldn't think of a better person to join Gillian in conversation this evening. AnthroVision is available for purchase from the library shop. Proceeds for purchases made at our shop go to benefit the library, so that's an additional reason for buying the book there. You can find a link to the shop in the chat and on the event page. And of course, if you have a New York Public Library card, or if you live in New York State and you want to apply for one now, you can also borrow the book from the library for free. I have just a few very quick housekeeping items, and then we will get right to the conversation. First, Gillian would love to answer some of your questions tonight. You can send them at any time using the chat or a Google form, or by emailing publicprograms@nypl.org. Also, I just need to let you know the library values your privacy. Letting you know that even though this video and the chat are hosted on NYPL.org page, they are indeed, in fact, hosted by YouTube. By participating in the chat, you might share data about yourself, which the library does not control. Okay, thank you so much for tuning in, and please join me in welcoming Tom Friedman and Gillian Tett.
Gillian, hi.
Hey, Tom.
Great to see you. You're in London. I'm in Colorado.
No, I'm actually in New York.
Oh, you're in New York. Okay.
Yeah, I live in New York.
Terrific. So. Well, I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed reading your book, and I just hope everyone watching this program immediately goes to the buy button and clicks buy this book, because I learned.
Oh, thank you. I didn't pay you to say that, but thank you.
This is really a terrific piece of work. So I think, for people to understand Anthro-Vision, because the title may be something that doesn't conjure up exactly what the book is about. I want you to do a little bio for us to start out, because you have the most unusual background for a Financial Times columnist. You started as an anthropology student, and explain to us, first of all, just how you got into anthropology, and then how you made the transition to financial reporting, and then we'll dig down on the links between the two.
Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, I wrote this book because I've had people coming up to me all through my journalistic career saying, how come you're so completely weird? And I use that phrase because actually people who write about finance and business and tech and markets usually have an MBA or a PhD in economics or in astrophysics or something like that. And in fact, I have a PhD in cultural anthropology, which is a branch of social science that studies human culture. And it was based on field work I did in Soviet Tajikistan, which is a part of the world that most people know very little about if they live in America or Europe. It's just north of Afghanistan on the map. And I went there because I stumbled into anthropology when I was a teenager, late teenager, because I was driven by a sense of curiosity about the world. I wanted to get out and travel. I grew up in a very boring suburban area, and I just wanted to get out and travel, have adventures, explore. Wasn't particularly noble, but hey, often ignoble sentiments can sometimes end up leading to better things. But so I studied anthropology as an undergraduate, didn't know what I wanted to do as after graduating, and decided to do a PhD and went out to Tajikistan. And not an obvious basis from which to build a career in financial journalism, but I passionately believe that the skills I learned as an anthropologist up in the mountains of Tajikistan are actually a really good basis to understand not just finance, but economics, politics, business, life. And I also passionately believe that we need to embrace them right now as we try and build back better, to use that terrible cliche.
So let's just go back to Tajikistan for a second. I wish you could share with us, I know you got some pictures, and talk a little bit about your precise research there to give people a flavor of how all this starts.
Yeah, well, I know for a lot of people, it's quite hard to imagine what Tajikistan would be like. I sometimes tell people to imagine the pictures you've seen of Afghanistan on the television reels, usually in relation to war, add in electricity and roads, because they had that in the place where I lived, although they didn't have running water or tap water, and then take out the black veils that women in Afghanistan wear, because in Tajikistan, they wear very colorful headscarves and tunics. But perhaps we can pull up the first slide and I can briefly explain. This is a picture of me in Tajikistan doing my research as an anthropologist. The nature of anthropology is that you aim to go and study other cultures by immersing yourself in other cultures and essentially living among and with the people you are trying to study. So the main photograph is me wearing a Tajik headscarf covering my hair against a mountainous, snowy backdrop. It was a Hindu Kush. And wearing one of the long stripy tunics, which are called atlas, red and white stripes. And next to that is a photograph of some of the people I used to live with in the village that I lived with, an old lady and a little girl called Michigona, some men who were wearing skull caps, eating food, sitting on the floor. And then we've got a picture of a family in a house with a typical blue walls. They love blue and white walls, and food spread out on the floor around a tablecloth. And if you go to the next slide, after that, which is slide number, that's right. What I was studying in Tajikistan was I was looking at marriage rituals. We have here some pictures of people dancing at a traditional marriage up in the mountains. We've also got pictures of a bride with a veil walking through with her new groom in a very ritualistic way. And then below that is a picture of me wearing a smart Tajik outfit with a traditional stripy pattern of the area and a headscarf. It's what I wore much of the time. And with a little boy dressed up in a golden outfit, because that's part of the festivities. And I was really studying marriage rituals as a way to understand how the Tajik village I lived with essentially grappled with the seeming contradiction to Western eyes of being both Muslim, Islamic culture, and also part of the Soviet communist system. And I believe that marriage rituals, essentially, like any ritual, express an idealized view of how people want to live. It's not reality, but it expresses an idealized view of how they'd like to live with all the symbols. And what I saw in those marriage rituals was actually many Western ideas about Islam and communism in the area were wrong, because there wasn't a massive conflict between them at the time, which Westerners assumed. In fact, there was a lot of accommodation. So that was really my PhD, which seems like a very, very long way away from the world that I now live in. Perhaps we can have the third slide, which is now I've gone from the tribes of Tajikistan to what I call the Davos tribe, the tribes of high finance, of television screens, of central bankers. Down on the right-hand corner, you've got a picture of me doing a Zoom call a couple of weeks ago with Jay Powell and Christine Lagarde and the other central bankers from China and France. I've got a picture of me at Davos with Jamie Dimon and Chelsea Clinton and all the people who hang out in the Davos tribe, that great big ritualistic event. And at the top, there's a picture of me in a television studio just recently talking about the G7. And you can take down the slides now, but the reason I put those two up one after the other is simply to illustrate that what I do now is look at other groups of human beings, social people, who are getting together, having rituals with symbols and social groups and things. And actually, it's not that different.
I love the way you refer to the Bloomberg village, gather around a Bloomberg machine, like a Tajik village, maybe gather around a well or some other locale. How did you then, just to bring us up to date, Gillian, talk about how you made the bridge from being an anthropologist to being a financial writer at the FT? Why would they hire you?
Good question. Basically, what happened was I did my field work. So I lived up in a village for just over a year. I then left and went back to write up my PhD. And I went for what was supposed to be 2 weeks of internship at the Financial Times, which by an extraordinary stroke of luck turned out to be the 2 weeks when the Soviet Union broke up. Wow. And at the time, I was the only person in the building. It was August, so everyone senior and important was on holiday. I was the only person in the building who spoke Russian and knew how to survive in that system. So I volunteered to go out for supposedly a couple of weeks as a on-the-ground reporter, and came back 6 to 8 months later, having essentially been a stringer, a freelance reporter, and really a war reporter, because I went from small war to small war, covering it. And in the course of that time, there was tragically a brutal, terrible civil war in Tajikistan, which I went back to. A huge number of people were killed, almost entirely unseen by the outside world. It was, a lot like Bosnia at the time, which overshadowed it. Tajikistan had the ghastly distinction of being the only country where people fled from it into Afghanistan. Everyone else was trying to get out of Afghanistan. And I was so upset by that I decided to become a journalist, originally to try and write about it for human rights reasons. But the FT was about the only publication that was interested in all parts of the world at the time, partly because it covers finance and business and money. And you need to look at all parts of the world if you're interested in business. So I joined the FT. They said to me, well, we are the Financial Times. You need to learn something about finance and money. They put me into the economics team. My initial reaction was, God, how boring. I want to go and write about small wars. This is kind of irrelevant, but I'll do it if that's what it takes to get a job. And 2 to 3 months later, after realizing that learning about economics and the language of economics was like learning about Tajik culture, I had to learn a new language, a new set of rituals. 2 or 3 months later, 2 or 3 months in, I realized that my reaction was driven by fear. As someone trained in culture, I was scared of economics, didn't really understand it. And then I realized I was completely wrong, that actually economics really mattered. If you don't know how money goes around the world, you don't really understand power. But I also realized that most of the people who understood how money went around the world only looked at how money went around the world, and they didn't put it in a context of culture and politics. And I thought, well, if I can find a way to bring these things together, these two pillars, yes, understand money and understand culture, then I can have maybe something meaningful to write about in the world. And that became really my sort of guiding ambition.
So let's talk about the structure of the book now. You really break it up into 3 parts. How we make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. Why do bankers misread risks, and why we need to listen to social science. So let's start with the first. That comes from a quote from Making the Strange Familiar and the Familiar Strange. Talk about why that is a really useful vehicle for navigating the world, for understanding what's going on around us.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think anthropology, gosh, isn't that weird and hippie? They think it's like Indiana Jones for academics. Go and look at weird rituals and exotic tribes and bones and things like that. And that's kind of how it was in the 19th century, when there was tremendous amount of arrogance, imperialism, racism driving the discipline. And then it did a complete U-turn intellectually in the 20th century and went from being a tool of racism to being very anti-racist and anti-imperialist, and went from looking at supposedly exotic people far away to looking back at the West as well. And the fundamental guiding principle of anthropology today is that you try and embrace culture shock as a good thing, which sounds kind of weird, but the reality is we're all hardwired to shy away from cultures that seem a bit different from us, whether that's people on the other side of the world like Tajikistan, or in the next door department at work, or at the end of the street, or heavens forbid, people who support a different political party. But anthropology argues that actually having a little bit of culture shock, immersing yourself in the minds and lives of someone who seems a bit different, creates a double win. It enables you to get empathy for a different point of view and way of life, which is crucial in a world that's both tightly globalized in a way that we're all exposed to other people all the time, even if we don't know it, but also very polarized and where we don't understand the people to whom we're exposed. So it gives you empathy for others, but it also, by nature of looking at other people, enables you to see yourself more clearly. Because the reality is, to cite a Chinese proverb, a fish can't see water. Nobody can see the world we live in, the assumptions we inherit, if that's the only thing we know because they're so familiar. So as a fish, you got to jump out of your fishbowl, go and look at other fish bowls, and then look back at yourself. Or ask fish in other fish bowls what they think of you. And that simple principle of trying to jump out of yourself a bit, either physically, when we can travel, let's hope, or simply mentally, is really what drives anthropology. And so what I did basically was I went to Tajikistan, learned a lot of things, including just how wrong I was about my assumptions about Tajikistan before. And then by virtue of my really weird career and a series of accidents, found myself in the Financial Times, writing about finance and politics and business, and then try to flip the lens to look at what was happening in the financial system before 2008, what was happening in business, and also what was happening in journalism as well.
You know, it's interesting because I have we met both later in our careers. My background is I got my degree, a BA and graduate degree in Arabic and Middle East Studies. I have a classic British Arabist education from Oxford, and in a way,
you didn't get the accent though.
No, exactly, and in a way, and a kind of accidental anthropology degree by living in the Beirut Civil War. That's why I so resonated with what you were saying. But listening to you, Gillian, it reminded me of something. So back then, I graduated from Oxford in '78, and I started on Fleet Street. Because I wanted to be in the field. I did not want to be an academic. And I had a challenge. I had to explain to people, justify how a little Jewish kid from Minnesota could be a fair reporter in Beirut and then in Jerusalem, because there had been no such animal. And so I had to think about, actually, what does it mean to be objective? And what you just said really touched on it. And I eventually would say to people to try to persuade them to hire me and then send me to the Middle East, was that we often confuse objectivity with the juror in a jury trial. We think the fairest, if we want to get a fair reporter in the Middle East, we bring a Gentile from Montana and plunk them down in the Middle East, and they'll be fair because they don't know anything about anything. But actually, objectivity is a tension between what you said, understanding and disinterest. If I don't actually almost see the world through your eyes, I can't possibly be fair to you. If I don't bring that empathy, but if I only see the world through your eyes, then I also can't be fair as a reporter. And it's actually this tension. So that really resonates with me.
I mean, I think another way to say it for a wider audience is, doesn't sound quite so academic, is to think about checks and balances. The American political system is founded on the principle of checks and balances being a good thing. If you ask any company today, what this D&I diversity stuff's about, at its core, it's about this idea that if you have different perspectives inside a group, you get checks and balances. Yep. And, we as journalists have to accept that we're never going to get 100% of the truth about anything. Yes. I often say if we get 40%, we're doing well on a good day. What keeps me going is I think many of my competitors get 30%. But, getting different perspectives on anything, being both emic or etic, both inside a system, but also outside, inside and outside of you, jumping between fishbowls, I think is the only way that we can collectively search for a better truth. And I know it's something you've done with tremendous power in your career.
I compare it to nature. In nature, monocultures are much more vulnerable to disease than polycultures. And what's true in nature, I think, is true in businesses and in society. So Gillian, give us an example of both making the strange familiar and the familiar strange, and why that's such a useful tool, and even helped you see the oncoming 2007, 2008 financial crisis before other financial experts.
Yeah, well, to talk about making the strange familiar, I'll simply say a couple of things. One is about my life, is that, the experience of living in Tajikistan showed me why most foreign policy experts were wrong about the Soviet Union before it broke up. This is now history, so frankly, no one really cares, and I won't go through the great details, but very broadly speaking, most of the diplomatic community pre the breakup of the Soviet Union thought the rebellion would come first in the Islamic areas. That was a guiding sense of the CIA. They used to talk about the soft underbelly, and it was wrong when I actually lived on the ground. Similarly, groups, I tell the story of Intel, one of the big tech companies that's used anthropologists to realize why often its perceptions of what consumers outside American markets are wrong, because historically, many companies like the tech sector have assumed that everybody was acting and thinking like a 25-year-old bro in Silicon Valley. And the idea that an Indian woman, say, might have a different view of tech was a bit of a shock. So that's another area where making the strange familiar can pay out.
Right.
And most immediately in the COVID crisis, there absolutely was a very real policy reason why you needed to understand strange, because if only Western policymakers had spent more time looking at what was happening in strange parts of the world, or places, I must say, that Donald Trump used to call shitholes.
Yes,
I think that's his word, not mine. Apologies for those who are offended by the word. If people had spent more time looking at strange then, the West would have been much better placed to tackle COVID than it actually was. But in terms of flipping the lens, perhaps the easiest way to explain what I mean by that is that when I became a financial reporter in 2004-05, I was running the capital markets team at the FT. And I went down to a big, seemingly boring investment banking conference in a very geeky area of finance called securitization, and sat in this big investment banking conference and used exactly the same intellectual path that I've used to study Tajik wedding rituals to study an investment banking conference. And actually, they're very similar.
It's one of the best parts of the book.
Investment banking conferences basically, like Tajik weddings, group together a scattered tribe. They allow that tribe to reaffirm their social ties and recreate them. And the rituals they do doesn't just reflect a certain shared worldview, it reproduces it as well and deepens the conviction of that. And the financiers, the credit derivatives geeks, like any group, had a set of tools to define their own identity. They all spoke the same geeky language, banker speak, that no one else understood. They felt quite separate from other people. They felt more in common with each other in what I call the Bloomberg village, because they spoke to each other on Bloomberg terminals than often their next door neighbors. They had a creation mythology, which every group has a creation mythology, and it's almost always designed to reinforce the position of the elites. And in this case, it absolutely reinforced the position of elites, and it was riddled with contradictions, like any creation mythology. They said that they were trying to make markets more liquid than ever, which would be good for everybody, but they failed to admit that actually the products they were creating were too complicated to actually trade. So they weren't actually free market prices for them. But no one could see that because they were so detached. And they also, most importantly, had complete tunnel vision, because they claimed that they were creating these products to try and help people, but there were no pictures of people in their slides at all. And they had become essentially used to imagining finance as being just algorithms, and they'd removed this idea there was somebody at the end of the chain. And if anyone's seen the movie The Great Short, it was only when some financiers went by chance and met a pole dancer in Florida in this movie, that great book by Michael Lewis.
Yeah.
And they bumped into an actual human and they realized what was happening before the subprime crisis. But the people I saw in the great tribal gathering of the investment banking conference didn't see that. So I used that kind of analysis to essentially look at what was happening and go, this is really dangerous, and started writing pieces in 2005 warning that there was going to be some kind of big trouble. Didn't predict the entire scale of the crisis, wouldn't pretend to have had such amazing crystal ball, but I did warn there was going to be trouble. And the thing that's amazing was that so few people actually saw that, because there were so few people acting like an anthropologist and trying to look inside out at what was going on.
You know, one of my mottos as a journalist has always been, all the stories I got wrong were because I was talking when I should have been listening. And
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've screwed up so many times as a journalist, and I talk about it in the book, and it's almost always when I forgot my anthropology training.
And you know, the other thing is, I don't think I ever told you this, but I actually changed my business card about 5 years ago. You say Thomas L. Friedman, New York Times foreign affairs columnist, and now it says New York Times humiliation and dignity correspondent. I realized in looking back at my career, basically what I've been covering was people acting out in their humiliation and questing for dignity. And they're two sides, they're just flip sides of the same coin. And it really is, everything else I found is pretty much commentary, you know, whether it was Palestinians versus Israelis or Iraqis versus Iranians. And that's what I was covering, you know.
Well,
and,
I mean, I agree, because I mean, in my case, you know, I having talked about anthropology and stuff like that, having used it for finance, predicting the financial crisis and stuff, you know, I then went on and forgot my anthropology training when we had the Brexit vote in the UK. And I lately assumed that I was, you know, because it was seemed self-evident to me as part of the global elite, part of the Davos tribe, I assumed that obviously Brexit was a bad idea. And when the Brexit vote came, I realized that I had lost touch and forgotten to listen to people who seemed different from me. And you don't have to go to Tajikistan to encounter difference. You can actually find it, in my case, within my own family or people down the end of the street. I was actually living in New York at the time. But when I went back to England, I realized just how arrogant and ignorant I'd been. And then I tried to use that experience for good and flip the lens and look back at the US and start listening much more during the Trump campaign to what people were saying and take out my own assumptions. And that was one of the things that led me to be fairly convinced early on that Trump was going to win.
Yeah. Going to take us through the second part of the book then. The second section, you know, why do bankers misread risk, but also talk about, there's a wonderful moment where Alan Greenspan asked you for a book on anthropology.
Yeah, that was amazing. I mean, basically, all in the run-up to 2008, I got a lot of flack from important, powerful people about the fact I kept writing about the dangers in credit derivatives, because there weren't many people talking about it at the time. And people who were, you know, loved this innovation would point to Alan Greenspan and say, look, Alan Greenspan, you know, he thinks all this deregulation is fantastic. And to me, he seemed like the ultimate anti-anthropologist, because he relied on these models and balance sheets and models and, you know, mathematical tools to think what was happening. Anyway, I would give Alan Greenspan a lot of credit for the fact that after the financial crisis, unlike many people, he really did try to rethink his ideas. He admitted there was a flaw in his thinking that he got criticized for, but I think the fact he said it was good. And a few years after the crisis, he stopped me in Aspen at the Ideas Festival and asked me if I knew any good books on anthropology. It turned out that, in fact, his vision of what he wanted to know was not quite what I thought anthropology was. He wanted to study why strange people look so weird. And what he was worried about in 2011, I think, was really why the Greeks were behaving in a way that seemed very strange to him in the Eurozone crisis. And he couldn't understand why the Greeks couldn't be more like the Germans, and wanted to know why. I said to him, well, actually, you could also look at the culture of central bankers. There's some great books I can recommend from anthropologists about this, and look at the culture of Wall Street. You know, I think he was less excited about that. But the fact that even someone like Alan Greenspan, the maestro, had a recognition after 2008 that culture mattered, I think was very symbolic of a wider mindset shift And I'd say that in the last decade, that recognition about the need to widen the lens has just accelerated. And COVID-19 and the pandemic has really put that on the radar screen, I think, of almost any leader today. And most people can't articulate the fact that something's going wrong with our other intellectual tools in terms of, wow, we need some anthropology. People talk about trying to widen the lens and looking more broadly, in terms of a search for sustainability. But it's basically about recognizing that so many of the tools we've used, like economic models, have tunnel vision, and we have to have lateral vision and look at the cultural context.
Yeah, one of my favorite, teachers likes to say, never think in the box, never think out of the box. Today, you must think without a box. And I really do think you need to arbitrage these different perspectives. I also often hear colleagues in the finance realm say, I just look at the data. And to which I always want to respond, I actually think talking to another human being is data. And you want to balance the two. You don't want to build large theories just on anecdote, but you don't want to build it just on data as well. But dive in a little more than on section 2, though. Why central bankers or bankers misread risks? Because basically they aren't, they're talking when they should be listening, and they aren't even listening to actual human beings.
I think that central bankers and bankers do misread risk because of this problem of tunnel vision. And they have concocted these amazing models of how markets and economies are supposed to work, which have, a core problem that they're bounded by whatever inputs you put into the model, and you tend to ignore what's outside that model. The image I sometimes use to communicate this is that, it's like walking through a dark wood at night with a compass. If your compass is working, you don't want to throw it away because it tells you roughly where to go. But if you walk through a wood at night just looking down at your compass, you're going to walk into a tree. And the problem is that if you don't look at context, you don't understand whether or not you've put the right data, to go back to your point, whether you put the right data into the model or not. And you also make a mistake that you assume that, Newtonian physics can be used to describe the behavior of humans. It was actually that wonderful physicist, Richard Feynman, who said that, you couldn't do physics if atoms talked to each other and interacted, because, of course, humans aren't like atoms. They change all the time. So I think those are the real problems that, people have been glued to these models. And it's true in economics too. I mean, for years, economists assumed that things which were outside the model, externalities, were basically things that you could just not ignore, like the environment. Companies would draw up balance sheets, and environmental risk would be at best a footnote. Again, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, because balance sheets are useful, economic models are useful. But they're compasses, and you have to realize what you're missing.
Yeah, one of the things I take away from my own 40 years is that people, God bless them, have bodies and souls. And the great mistake leaders and investment bankers make is thinking you can feed just one and not the other. Sooner or later that catches up to you.
Well, you see, I couldn't agree more. And see, one of the things I keep saying is I'm not saying anthropology is the only answer at all.
It's about bringing
I'm saying that it's basically complementary to many of the other tools that people use. And one of the reasons I feel this message is needed so much now is that, the pandemic COVID-19 has been a brutal shock for many of us. It's basically been enforced culture shock. We've been forced to suddenly go home, jump into digital space, and now many of us are being forced to go back into real life. And that's forced us to recognize that nothing we've had in our lives in the past that we took for granted necessarily is fixed in stone. We need to rethink and can rethink many of our patterns. So it's an amazing opportunity for us all to be like amateur anthropologists as we look at the world around us. But quite aside from the pandemic, which, by the way, has shown us why we're all interconnected with the global system and exposed to people we don't understand. I mean, if more people had basically bothered to know where Wuhan was on the map and hadn't just ignored it because it seemed strange, again, the COVID-19 pandemic wouldn't have been so bad. But quite apart from that, digitization is transforming culture today in ways that are both scary and exciting. And AI is so prevalent and so dominant. And one of the things I say often is that AI, artificial intelligence, needs a second type of AI, anthropology intelligence, to understand the cultural context that no computer system is ever going to be able to understand perfectly. And if you want to understand why, I spoke the other day to a group of AI experts who tell me that to date, no AI platform has ever managed to tell a really good joke. And the reason is that a joke, by definition, defines a social boundary, because you're either in the in-group who gets a joke or you're not. And computers find it hard to tell exactly who's in and out of boundaries. But also jokes exist because they play off unstated contradictions in culture. Culture isn't fixed. It's like a river. It's constantly moving and new streams come in and go out. And it's often got different levels of currents that are contradictory. And that's how laughter occurs.
Yeah.
And that's tough. No big data system can really model that easily.
It reminds me, when I was in Beirut, my most trusted economic source on the Beirut economy was a glazier. And I would go see him regularly, because when Lebanese were replacing their broken windows, they were optimistic that the war was dying down. And when they weren't, when his business was bad, it told you they were really, really worried. The other thing you learn, and it's sort of related to your Tajikistan experience, is that people's ability to adapt, human beings' ability to adapt, is actually phenomenal, even in a civil war. My favorite quote from Beirut was a hostess at a dinner party who turned to her guests at one point and said, "Would you like to eat now or wait for the ceasefire?" And, just like one of the things you couldn't in 100 years make up, you know what I mean? But it's about the people's ability to balance danger, and the desire for normality is so much more profound than people realize. You've sort of talked about it, but talk about section 3, then why the social sciences therefore are so important. Because to me, I would assign your book in every journalism school, but also every business school.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, basically, very simple. I believe that when you jump out of your fishbowl and jump between fishbowls, and I should quickly stress, by the way, I don't regard cultures and races and different ways of living as boxes. It's actually a spectrum. I can't stress that strongly enough. So when I use the word fishbowl, it's not a perfect metaphor. No. They're not boundaries. But when you actually get an insider-outsider perspective of the sort that you've had in so much of your career, Tom, what you can see is not just the noise that shapes different cultures, but the silence, the stuff that we ignore, the assumptions we inherit but never talk about because they're seen as boring or geeky or dull or obvious or taboo or wrapped up in technical language. And what we don't talk about, social silence, is often more important than what we do talk about. So in the last section, I try and give some examples of where thinking about social silence, what we ignore, can really help us understand the world. Whether it's thinking about Donald Trump and why it was that when he said bigly, journalists all laughed. And the reason was a lot to do with the fact that the silence was that journalists had assumed that command of language, control of words, was a source of credibility and status, but not everyone did. And so, that was, one way of looking at that situation. I talk about teenagers and cell phones. Issue of very close to my heart because I have 2 teenagers, and I've worried for years about why teenagers are so obsessed with their cell phones. You can look at the noise in that debate, which is actually by looking at the cell phone, or you can look at the silence, which is what happens around the cell phone, which is the physicality of teenagers' lives, which is the fact that many teenagers have become very constrained physically in the last 100 years. They can't roam physically as their grandparents did, and just go and wander around town late at night and bump into their friends and have adventures, because middle-class parents in America are basically controlling them increasingly. So the only place they can roam is in cyberspace. So you can't understand cyberspace, the noise of that, without looking at silence of real life. But then I apply the same message to looking at office culture, what really drives office culture, which is incredibly relevant to where we are today, with people thinking of going back to the office or not. And I talk about what really matters, say, around the tech economy and the barter trade at the heart of the tech economy that economists miss. And I think this model of looking at social silences can be applied to almost any area of our life, whether you're working in law or economics or politics or business, because we need to have this debate about what we're missing.
So I love that section, and it really is one of my abiding rules of journalism. Sometimes the news is in the noise, sometimes it's in the silence. And the greatest wisdom you can have as a journalist is learn how to listen to the silence. And I learned that very early on in my career. The New York Times sent me to Beirut. I'd been on the paper for 6 months sent me to Cairo to be part of the team that covered the aftermath of Sadat's assassination. And I was so excited to just be part of this big news story. And I got there and I realized Egyptians weren't sad. This guy that we in the West had elevated into this year, and people just, he had disconnected from his own population. And that really, I have another rule of journalism, which is one of my favorite rock songs is a song called by Neon Trees, a rock band. And the song is Everybody Talks. And what you learn in Tajikistan village, what you learn in Beirut or even on Wall Street, everybody talks. They know who's cheating, who's lying, everybody talks. And I was having a profound conversation with a very close friend of mine from Minneapolis, a Black leader in Minneapolis, where I'm from. And she was talking about the pain of Black mothers there. If your kid is killed in community violence and you put up a GoFundMe page to help with burial or healing, you might get $20,000, $30,000. But if you're killed by a Black cop, you can get $1 million. And like everybody in the community knows, they're talking about that, but it doesn't break out. But they all know, they all know, and how we outsiders learn to tell that story in a respectful way that also, and this is always the danger, that isn't used by other people to actually put down. It's a very difficult story right now, I find, to navigate, but listening to all of these things right now is just super, super important. And in this highly politicized moment, there's so many people want to latch onto your reporting. Like if you tell that story, they want to use it basically for their own political purposes. So it's one of the dangers of anthropology. I just want to check if we can go to the chat for a second, Gillian, to see if we have some questions. So I'm going to call up the chat here for a second and see if we have any questions. And do we hear? Otherwise, I will go on to my, I'll just keep asking them. And are the questions up in the chat or not?
I can see a couple of questions myself.
Okay, well, can you, I can't just take one that strikes you, because I can't.
Well, someone said, it seems that every 10 years, the business world rediscovers anthropology as a tool or perspective. Why doesn't it stick? Why do they celebrate it and then revert to more traditional practices? Well, that's a great question, because, anthropologists have been creeping into business world for a number of years, but most people don't know about it. They've mostly been employed to study the customers of businesses. They haven't, for the most part, been used to flip the lens and look back at businesses themselves. And I would argue in many ways that is the most urgent thing that needs to happen right now, particularly in sectors like tech. It should have happened back before 2008 in finance. I wish it had, because that would have actually helped the financiers see what was going so badly wrong. If it had happened in tech, but earlier, it may have avoided some of the tech lash. And I think it probably is a secret to the tech companies dealing with tech lash today, is to try and see the world from different perspectives and see how their own assumptions and sort of cultural tribal patterns are distorting their own actions and worldview. But the simple reason why anthropologists tend to not be used by business on a regular basis is partly because their messages often make business people uncomfortable. They often expose things that people don't really want to acknowledge or look at. But it's also because anthropologists are often pretty bad at hustling to get their ideas out. And that's really a function of the nature of the people who go into anthropology, who are attracted to it as a discipline because they are interested in sitting quietly and patiently in the bushes watching other people in a way that's very interesting. They're good listeners. But good listeners often feel very shy about hustling their way into the center of the pulpit or center of the crowd. Plus, many anthropologists are quite cynical about power and money and don't want any part of that system. And their messages are often shades of grey about what's happening in life, because life is about shades of grey. And in a world where everything is boiled down to black and white, it's often hard to communicate that. But, I do think that there is a need for anthropology today in business, finance, politics, whatever else. So I hope that this time round, there will be more success. And what gives me some hope is that I think that many businesses recognize that the rise of sustainability is a sign of people looking for a new frame. And in many ways, what I call Anthro-Vision is sustainability, ESG by another lens. And I also am very encouraged by the fact that there are more efforts underway now to get academic ideas into the mainstream. Platforms like The Conversation, which is a brilliant innovation that takes academic research to a wider audience. Podcasts, things like Sapiens, a website that also highlights this. These are all really good tools to actually highlight these ideas for a wider audience.
Yeah, so one of the points you make is the importance of breaking down silos. I'm a huge believer in that, and arbitraging these kind of multiple perspectives to see the story. So for me, the way I do that, I arbitrage what I call, Mother Nature, sort of environmental, climate, all of those perspectives. Second, technology, what's happening at the edge of technology. And third, what you call anthropology, what I would simply call Beirut, sort of the crazy, unpredictable things that humans do. And so if you had asked, and that's something I wish I understood as a journalist when I started, I didn't, I only understood it sort of looking backward. But if you had asked, me in 1978, right when I graduated from, in Arabic and Middle East studies, what happened in Syria in the last 10 years? That Tom Friedman would have said, what happened was actually there was a coup. It was kind of like when Adib Shishakli overthrew, Mohammed Dar, whatever. If you ask me today, I tell you actually what happened was that Syria experienced the worst drought in its modern history from 2006 to 2010. A million Syrian farmers and herders left their homes, flocked to the cities, lived on the margins. No one did anything for them. Then they got this thing called a cell phone. They watched the revolution in Tunisia and Egypt, and then they blew the lid off the place. So you could only see the story if you're arbitraging all three of those perspectives. So that's my way of de-siloing my journalism. What's yours? What are the different perspectives you're kind of arbitraging when you're looking at a story today?
Well, I am a great believer in doing two or three things. One is this point about trying to listen to social silence, not just noise. And that means, constantly asking yourself, what am I not asking? What is no one saying? Going in as a journalist into interviews and finishing off with a question like, so is there anything I've not asked you which you'd like to mention at the end of an interview? I find is often a really powerful way to bring out new thoughts and ideas. And sometimes people will just say, oh, nothing much. But sometimes they come out with something I'd not even thought about, which was just completely off my radar screen. And the other thing I'm a great believer of is trying to collide with the unexpected, trying to make sure that not everything I do as a journalist is within my natural field or within my lane. Do unusual events, say yes to an invitation to something completely out of my normal sphere. Just by way of a small example, I said yes to speak at a book event the other day with a group in Liverpool who weren't the kind of big Davos tribe. They weren't people who are going to go out and buy 10,000 books or whatever else like that. But boy, did I learn a bunch of new ideas I hadn't thought about. It was fascinating. So making space to collide with the unexpected is crucial. And then the other thing is that, recognizing the shortcomings of journalistic teams themselves. Because, media organizations create teams that are set up to cover the world that existed 10 years ago and tend to replicate the silos and patterns of the people we're writing about. And so, we have to find ways to try and break that down.
Yeah, that's really good. I love that, making space to collide with the unexpected. Before I wrote, when I was working on my last book, thank you for being late, my lecture agent called me one day and said, I've got a lecture offer you to speak in Lancaster, Pennsylvania for a group called the Hourglass Foundation. I said, fine, it's part of my book tour, put him on. And a week before I went there, he said, oh, Tom, I forgot to tell you, there's a 90-minute reception with their group before your lecture. I said, Carlton, you're killing me. I mean, I mean, come on, 90 minutes, you know. So anyways, I go there and suddenly people start coming up to me and say, I'm from the Lancaster, Health Coalition. I'm from the Lancaster Education Coalition. I'm from the Lancaster Lead Abatement Coalition. And I realized I was in some amazing place. And before the evening was done, I had signed up with them to come back for 2 days of reporting. And I eventually wrote really a long piece about Lancaster. And the story was how a town had basically righted itself, you know, and I never would have gone unless I had thrown myself into that setting.
Well, I mean, having the luxury of being able to roam is a luxury. And in the modern world where we're all basically under such pressure in whatever profession you are, the temptation is always to try and be efficient and directed and make sure you have a quick return on your investment of time or whatever else, or attention.
Yeah, that's really well said.
Trying to roam and have collided the unexpected is crucial. The one other thing I'd mention is that I'm often asked, and I think, Tom, you might have views on this as well, that, you know, okay, so you're saying that we need to basically take a broader perspective and jump out of our fishbowls or our silos or our ghettos. You know, what do you do in a media that's so polarized and where basically one function of extreme digitization is customization? You customize your news and information. And, you know, America's at war with itself in different political tribes. And so the media just gives each tribe what they want. And that's a problem. We can't run away from that. What I often talk about, though, I think which is so important, is the concept of domino theories. And this idea, not in the sense of dominoes all toppling over, but that we need to recognize that as journalists, we need to find ways to communicate with our audience or anybody who's in any position of trying to communicate with people. So you need to find one half of your domino that matches someone else's domino just to get them attention and focus and pull them into the conversation. But the second half of the domino, the other half of the piece, can be a different number. So you can write a story which taps into your audience and then say, but actually, let me take you somewhere else. Or if you're trying to talk to people as a CEO, leader, or a lawyer, or anything else, politician, you can tap into a stereotype and then debunk that stereotype if you can. So that's something I feel very strongly.
Yeah, that's very well said. Gillian, is there another question there? Because I can't see them. And if you
there's two questions. One is, how do you avoid a research black hole? Someone is saying that they've researched a culture and they hope they're done, but there are research questions I can't answer yet. How do you target secondary research? Well, the reality is there's always a black hole. In any field, you know, I always try to remind myself that as a journalist, I have 40% of the situation at best in terms of my understanding. I do my best. And there's always more that I can discover and find. And it requires, you know, a sense of humility to go and listen afterwards to try and understand where you might have got things wrong. And the same is true of being an anthropologist. And, you know, it's very hard in the modern society, in the modern world, to say, you know what, this was my best shot. I had a go of understanding it. I may not have understood everything, but we need to recognize that trying your very best to understand something is better than not trying at all. And so that, you know, again, back to checks and balances would be my answer for that one. How do you feel, Tom, about that?
Yeah, the way I reacted, it really resonates, is that I always try to tell people I'm actually in a conversation, you know, that I'm in a dialogue with the world, okay? And that if you judge me by one column, you're really missing the point, because I'm actually engaging with this thing. You know, I wrote about, I'm very controversial for some people, and it's too long to get into now. I wrote about MBS in Saudi Arabia. I actually wrote 8 columns, and they really were wrestling with it in different ways. But people will seize on one line in one column, and then they use that to beat you over the head. And they don't realize that what I was engaged in, I was really trying to think this through in a conversation. By the way, getting darker and darker as it was going along. But the way the world works and the way the web works today, there's just such a takedown culture that people aren't interested that you might actually be on a journey. You know what I mean? And that you just didn't lob a bomb out there. You're actually trying to engage with this thing. But that's just it's why I'm not on Twitter. You know what I mean? Because I really don't want to be distracted from the journey or write in response to a single person. And
well, I mean, another way I was going to talk about it is that actually journalism, or, you know, media, has gone from being a verb, gone from being a noun to a verb. And in a sense, we now have the ability because of technology to interact with audiences. I am on Twitter, and I try to read the comments of my pieces to try and learn from people. Sometimes it's hurtful, sometimes it's irritating. Often I sit there and think, gosh, why didn't I think about that? And so I learn from people. But it's really it's a verb now.
Yeah, it's true. I really do read the comments on my column that I'm interested in, and there is usually there's a left extreme and a right extreme, but in the middle, you'll find interesting stuff, and it never fails. It's so interesting you say that on any column, I will find comments that are so breathtakingly smart that I will cut them out and save them, and literally say there is wisdom in crowds. You have to find it. Doesn't always present itself, but I benefit a lot from that, and that's what I use as a sort of feedback loop.
I mean, there's one other question I'd love to address, which is, what do you think anthropology can offer to pre-K through 12th grade education?
Wow.
And I guess I feel really strongly about this, particularly as we come out of the pandemic lockdown, hopefully come out of that. And so let me just offer 3 or 4 ideas very quickly. One is, lockdown by its nature has not just locked us down physically, it's basically often trapped us with people who are exactly like us, our own social pod. And it's often encouraged myopia, because even before lockdown, as we have embraced cyberspace, we have gone increasingly into a world where we don't just copy the tribalism in the real world into cyberspace, but we intensify it, because digitization gives us tools to customize our identity, our group, our information sources online, even more powerfully than in the real world. And so going online into small spaces with people just like us, I think has made many people even more prone to myopia and clinging to their own. And something I notice amongst, I've got 2 teenagers, and something I notice amongst other teenagers and other people like that is, understandably, there's a culture of fear. I think there's a culture of risk aversion. And I think there's actually a feeling of kids clinging to what they know and not wanting to get out and travel the world and go and taste adventure or go and explore the unfamiliar right now. Now, that's my own tiny little perspective of, where I live and the circle that I move in. But I don't see lots of kids who have the same, urge that I had as a teenager to get the hell out of whatever boring suburbia I was in and travel, which you clearly had, Tom. So the first thing I would love to tell anyone involved in education is, it is so critical now to widen the lens. Support educational exchanges. Support any way you can to get exposure to different culture and different points of view. Just teach kids that there are many ways to live, and whether you do that through film, through movies, through going to talk to different communities in your own town, or through actually travel when it becomes available, I would urge everyone to embrace that from the bottom of my heart. I'd urge people to recognize that you don't have to be locked into just humanities or sciences. And I'd also, last but not least, urge every school to teach their kids, alongside issues about cyberbullying, cybersecurity, cyber hygiene, to teach them about cyber tribalism and how to counter that.
Gillian, this has been so much fun, and I have to say, it's because I do believe in roaming. When the public library came to me and said, would you do this book event with Gillian on her new book? I hadn't read your book, but I thought, well, that'll force me to read it, and I know it'll be interesting. And it's actually been a mother lode. So
thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope
someone who's been my intellectual hero for so many years. I mean, the world is flat, just transformed my thinking, and I drew on it quite a bit in my own book. That means a lot, so thank you.
It's a terrific book. I hope everyone goes out and buys it and shares it. And I've had so much fun. So thank you, Gillian. Thank you to New York Public Library, and we'll sign off.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us tonight. We are playing closing slides. This slide shows an image of the featured book. The cover text is set in the center of a red border and reads, Anthro-Vision, A New Way to See in Business and Life, Gillian Tett, author of The Silo Effect. A motif repeats throughout the red border, showing a drawing of a human figure holding a large paper clip with one end bent open to resemble a bow. They are shooting an arrow at an image of a computer mouse pointer. AnthroVision is available for purchase from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shoplive. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide shows live from NYPL upcoming events. Monday, June 28th, 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The Heart of Business, Hubert Joly with Ariana Huffington. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.